Welcome to the Fiction Workshop with Dr. M. The doctor is in.
Welcome to the Fiction Workshop. I'm Dr. M. We're brand new, so I should say a few things about what a workshop is. Historically, you had writing salons. You'd have writers that would get together in maybe in a cafe or maybe at a bar or maybe just at someone's apartment. And they would talk about writing. They would give each other feedback on their work. They would inspire each other. Universities started doing this kind of thing, and writing groups have done this sort of thing. Usually it is a group. We're sort of a group. There's one day soon, maybe, there'll be more of you out there. You can always participate in the comments. You can send in a story if you would like a critique. I know that's a scary thing, but that's part of what this is about. You reach a level as a writer where you are able to get feedback, make use of it, and grow. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at stories that are sent in. I'm going to say the kinds of things that would normally get said in a workshop. And hopefully those of you out there will be able to pick up on some of the things that I've learned and can use it in your own writing. Our first writer is going to introduce himself. I'm going to talk a little bit about the beginning of his story, and then he's going to read an excerpt from the middle, and we will also talk about that section as well. Let me say, first of all, thank you to Matthew for sending this story and letting us put it out there into the world. I know, again, this is not an easy thing to do, but I feel good about it. This is a story that I think it's got a lot of promise, and hopefully he'll be able to make it something great.
Hi, my name is Matthew. I am a senior studying English, and I'm about to begin applying to grad school to get my MFA in writing. I have been writing stories for a few years now, but I haven't been published in any national or regional magazines. I did get published in my campus magazine not too long ago. I won an award, won $75, and I'm hoping that with a little more help, a little more workshopping, a little more polishing, I can move on up to the next stage of my career. So this is a story called Cutting My Losses. It is about a old, jaded rock star who was part of a band that was a one-hit wonder in the 80s. And now he's at a bar listening to live music when he hears a cover of one of his songs. And this cover is better than his original ever could be. And he is overcome with a variety of emotions and ends up doing something that he regrets. This is a story about what makes real art and about what happens to people who can't let go of the past.
We're going to talk about the beginning of the story, Cutting My Losses. Like a lot of stories, it begins with a setting. This is a great technique. It's really common because it works. You see it in film, you see it in a lot of traditional short stories that you describe the setting, you're describing the ground that the character stands on, and then you introduce the main character, and then the story takes off. Now, one of the things about setting is that it establishes mood. If you describe a haunted house to me, I know the kind of story I'm in. I have certain expectations about it. So in this case, it's a dive bar. If you took the 80s and converted it into a dive bar, you would more or less have Abe's Place. It wasn't that it had a theme or that the owner had a particular love for the time period. It had simply not seen a single change since the late 80s, not even the leaky pipe in the bathroom. Now, there's two things going on here. It is starting to describe the setting. We're getting some ideas about it. I would like a lot more concrete detail. The rest of the paragraph is going to be about the leaky pipe. And so the leaky pipe is doing a lot of the work of signifying dive bar. The other thing that's going on here is
that it's establishing voice. So we have language like particular love, perpetually placed. This is the voice of the narrator coming through. My main interest as a reader at this point is give me the details so I know where I'm at. And I think you can do this a lot more efficiently and effectively with a list. A list is a great technique. If you give a lot of concrete detail, you can give a lot of concrete detail in a very short space. So the list could give me details that signify 80s, details that signify dive bar, details that signify a little later down here we learn that it's Nashville. Lists are hard to write. You have to rewrite it, move things around, add and subtract to it. But eventually, after you've given it some time, you're not usually going to be able to write a good list in one sitting. Then it's going to establish the details of the place very quickly. The reader will know where we are. And it's going to give the reader confidence in this writer because you've given us what we need. Now, I want to rewrite this opening, not to suggest that I think I can write it better than the writer, but because I want to focus on, because I want to edit out the you. That's the real reason here. Okay, so I'm thinking that if we start with Abe's place hadn't changed since the 80s. And I think that'll get Abe's place there first. And it'll set it up quickly so that I can get into my list.
This young woman is singing a cover of his song, the titular Cutting My Losses. It needs a little work, I know this, but it's kind of the turning point of the story, and I think it has a lot of potential. Oliver's eyes widened in shock. It was his song. He had heard covers of Cutting My Losses before, of course. It was the most popular song he'd ever write, and he wasn't even very proud of it. He wrote it to be a radio-friendly song, and radio-friendly it was. The band had hoped it would be a jumping-off point to some of their more complex songs and albums, but by the time they had split up, they knew Stone River Canyon was a one-hit wonder. Oliver had to sing it at every concert, even as a solo artist. The words had begun to make him sick. It was a song about a painful breakup that he had never experienced. He had dated several women, sure, but when they ended, he never felt pain. Maybe in the moment it felt like pain, but as he listened to the girl's rich voice now, he realized that every breakup he ever experienced had an undertone of relief. She sang it with feeling, with passion, with wisdom. She sang his words, although they hardly even felt like his words anymore, as if she understood them more than he ever could. She had stripped every extraneous detail to the song and sung it with such clarity, purpose, and pain. It was as if a half-formed, shapeless idea was suddenly being made manifest and profound. For once, the lyrics didn't make Oliver sick. When she sang it, it was an entirely new song, and Oliver was hearing it for the first time. When the song finished, the audience cheered and clapped and whooped and hollered in ecstasy. No one noticed the old man with the bad dye job who sat at the bar, crying.
So from Matthew's introduction to the story, kind of a summary of where the story goes. This scene, I would agree, is the climax. It has the potential to be an epiphany, and I should talk a little bit about what that means. It's probably most famous in James Joyce's work. He used that term. It's a religious term. It's the moment when the bread at the Last Supper, the bread turns into the body of Christ. And so it's this magical moment of transformation. Now, in James Joyce's stories, the two most famous examples would be Araby and the Dead. And both of his epiphanies come at the end of the stories. It's usually talked about as a moment of realization for the character, and this is true, it's what it is. But I think there's a second aspect to it, and this is something that I learned. I learned this from Stuart Dybek, and I can link below to an interview where he talks about this a little bit, but it's where I learned the trick, and it's not just a moment of realization, but the narrative changes, the mode of telling changes. So in Araby, at the end of that story, there is some dialogue, and it's dialogue that's really nonsense dialogue. It's some people who are in this at the bazaar, and they're trying to sell their wares, and they're just sort of flirting with each other. And so you get dialogue like, no, I didn't, yes, I did, no, I didn't. But what it does is it changes the way that it feels to read that passage. So for a reader, while this character is undergoing a change, the experience of reading also changes. In The Dead, what happens is the passage becomes lyrical. It becomes like a poem. It's more poetic than the prose that had preceded it in the story. So my advice to Matthew is to try to do something different with that passage. In other words, in his introduction, he felt like it needed work. Just mess with it, make it different. I think it could be that you would introduce dialogue there. It could be that you would make it poetic there. But it should, because it's such an important passage, the reading of it should feel a little different. And if you're able to do that, that's really powerful. Now, the hard part is, where do you come back from that? James Joyce sticks it at the end of his stories, so he doesn't have to come back from the Epiphany, right? It's Epiphany and done. But what Matthew has happening is an ending that, for me as a reader, so it doesn't feel emotionally right, because he has this moment that I think is really potentially powerful. He sees someone else sing his song, someone quite young, and it reminds him that he's an artist. And he sees the song for maybe even the first time. And I think that's a really great idea for a story. I think readers will like it. One of the difficulties with that is, where do you go from there? In the story that Matthew wrote, he touches the girl. The girl's quite young. This gets the father upset. He doesn't realize she's as young as she is until this moment. And the bar pretty much gangs up on him. He gets beaten up. So I think he's had a really nice moment, and he maybe deserves a little better than that. I don't want to tell Matthew how to write the story or how to change it, but I do think that if the story needs to go past this moment, and it probably does at least a little bit, then maybe a connection with the girl, a connection with the father, a connection with someone at the bar. It feels like it should match emotionally what happens in that moment, or push it beyond that. And I think that's one of the tricky things about literary story writing is you don't always know where you're going to go. And if the writer is sometimes surprised, then it will be a surprise for the reader. And it usually tends to work out well. And so sometimes you have to throw an ending away and rewrite it and see what you come up with. Well, thank you to Matthew, and that was the workshop. Normally we'd have other people around to disagree with me. If you disagree with me, put it down in the comments. I'm tough-willed. What I like about a workshop usually is that when the group gets talking, I don't always feel the same way that I did coming into it. And so the group dynamic, hearing lots of different opinions, is always a good thing. Well, think about sending in a story. You can contact me at writingwithdrm@yahoo.com. It's all written together. Writingwithdrm@yahoo.com. Keep writing.